All right, everybody ready?
Roll. Ready.
Okay. Last time we've been kind of crawling here, especially took us 3 times to get through the first chapter. But my plan is to finish the second one tonight, which we kind of cut it in half as best as I could.
14.
Yep, starting in 14, and I'm just going to read Ruth 2:14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, that's Ruth, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. All right. So the last time we looked at this story in chapter 2 to start off, it was Boaz and Ruth had met for the first time, right? And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact of something that was said in the last section that we read in verse 13, where Boaz says Ruth had come to take refuge with God. So this isn't a story, even though we could cast it as a love story, or it's definitely a husband and wife getting together story. It's not that Ruth is primarily seeking refuge in a man or in a relationship or in marriage, but even Boaz admits you're seeking refuge and taking refuge in God. Well, in her pursuit of God, she has met a man, and as it just so happened, and we're going to continue to look at this first real interaction, the second half of it, that they have with each other. So the first part of tonight's selection of verses that we read starts with a mealtime. It's probably lunch, just because after this meal it says she worked till evening, so then that would be dinner time. But it says in verse 14, "At mealtime Boaz said to her, 'Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine.' So she sat beside the reapers," that's the rest of Boaz's work crew, "and he passed to her roasted grain." That might have been what they were harvesting, but it could also have been, it probably is some sort of bread here. And then it says she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So this is their really first interaction. Part 2 continued, and she had spent the morning gleaning, and then he basically invites her over for lunch. to sit with the rest of the crew. But just from reading verse 14 about an invitation to a meal, what they ate, and how much she ate, and what we're told in verse 14, what other stories in the Bible do you think this reminds you of in any kind of way? I guess I got a couple in here that I'm thinking of.
Which part in particular?
Verse 14, just the whole thing. There's really three tie-ins I think we could make.
In the upper room.
Okay.
Jesus says, "Break this bread, remind me of my body, and the wine to represent my blood."
Yeah, that's one of them I was thinking of.
And his disciples.
Right. What we would, I have it written here, either we could call it the Passover meal with the disciples. I think the upper room is technically where they gather in Acts 1.
Okay.
But, so, I don't know. I get those mixed up. No, you know what? No, upper room is in the Gospels and Acts is in a different place. Yeah. So, right. Or we could think of that as what the painting portrays as the Last Supper, right? I think that's Da Vinci.
Yeah.
And then we could also say this is the scene where Jesus institutes communion, like where you eat the bread and the juice. Yeah. So that's one connection. I think there's another one I'm thinking at the last phrase. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. What? Your jaw dropped. What are you thinking?
Nothing, I don't know.
Oh. All right, I'm thinking of the feeding of the 5,000. Okay, and Luke 9:17 is the key phrase from that. Hudson's got it.
And they all ate and they were satisfied, and what was left over was picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces.
Yeah, so that just kind of, there's a ringing in that verse of what we see here in Ruth. And Ruth ate until she was satisfied, it says, which one shows me she wasn't afraid to eat in front of Boaz, which I remember as a kid, my sister would go on a date or something, and she would come home with this big box of leftovers, and she's like, well, I didn't want to eat it all in front of who I was going with, so now I'm going to sit on the couch and eat it now that I'm in the privacy of my home, right? So this is the thing, that's a side note, that some girls, they're like, oh, I'm not hungry, but then they really want to eat. So Ruth wasn't afraid to eat in front of Boaz. But it also shows Boaz was capable of providing for Ruth. And just like in the feeding of the 5,000, she was sent home with leftovers. Now the Passover meal, the Last Supper, communion, whatever, that's in all four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we're going to read from the Matthew version, and it's chapter 26, verse 26 through 28.
Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing, it broke and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat this, my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins."
Yeah, so just a note, there are people today who still take communion in the way that Ruth eats this meal here, where Boaz says eat some of the bread and dip it in the wine. That is, just as a side note, a practice that still goes on today. But what's happening in this scene with Ruth and Boaz is that he's feeding the woman who is his future bride, just as husbands should do in terms of providing for the physical needs of their wives, and just as Jesus does for the spiritual needs of the church. And this whole connection between what husbands do for wives, what Jesus does for the church, is made in Ephesians 5:25 through 30. Someone's got that.
Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body.
So yeah, one of the things it says about a husband's love towards the wife is that he nourishes her like he's nourishing his own body, and that Jesus does the same thing for the church. So if you think about the church service as like a meal where God serves, you could make the argument that's why we call it a church service. Some people would flip it around and say, well, we come to serve others. I think both take place, where God serves us his word, his grace, and sometimes, depending on how often you do it, an actual meal, something you eat, which we call the Lord's Supper or communion. Now, as to what Boaz and Ruth were eating together, it's bread. And the Hebrew word for bread that's used when Boaz says, come here, eat some bread, is lechem, which you can hear the full word Bethlehem. Remember, it's called House of Bread. That's why the town was named that. So they're eating bread, and as for what she dips it in, we can be pretty sure it's some sort of wine, although the word there is used for wine or wine vinegar, or vinegar, as some of your translations have that. Did you notice that? If you're in the ESV, I guess you have whatever I read, but a lot, like the New King James, I think, calls it wine vinegar. So some people would take this as like a condiment that they're using and not necessarily a drink. Others would just say they're drinking a little bit of wine. Now, we could certainly imagine it as like a dipping sauce with wine and vinegar and some oil. You've maybe seen that at a restaurant or something like that. But the Old Testament uses this Hebrew word for wine or wine vinegar in terms of an alcoholic drink. And we know this because in Numbers 6, 2 and 3, we're given what's called a Nazirite vow. So certain Hebrew men would take this vow where they wouldn't touch certain things, they wouldn't eat certain things, they wouldn't drink certain things. Do you remember who in the Old Testament took this vow or followed this system?
Joe?
Not that I know of. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is Samson. So Samson had one of the rules was you're not supposed to touch a dead body, and then of course there's a story where he touches a dead body. So he kind of breaks these rules along the way. But hey, God has given us all laws that we've broken. So anyway, Numbers 6, 2 and 3 uses the same word for wine in terms of a drink, like an alcoholic drink.
Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat grapes, fresh or dried.
Yeah, so it's a vinegary wine of some sorts, And that brings me to the third and final story that this one verse reminds me of elsewhere in the Bible. And it's Jesus on the cross. And there's two verses we're going to read that tie into this wine vinegar. One is Psalm 69:21. Matthew's got it.
They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink.
Yeah, so that's actually kind of a messianic poem or prophecy, and then it's fulfilled in John 19:28 through 30.
After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
Yeah, so just think about Jesus, who walked on water, who in Colossians 1 we're told he is the God who made everything. He made water. And on the cross, cries out in thirst, and then this is the drink that he's given. And so Jesus endured all that pain for you, so that you would have a seat at the Lord's table, and he has provided for you in ways that are similar to how Boaz is just starting to provide for Ruth. But yeah, even in some of Jesus's sermons, there's someone calls out to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat at the Lord's table in the kingdom of heaven," or eat bread in the kingdom of heaven, or something like that. And one of my favorite parables, I actually did a Sunday sermon on this, because it was last minute, and for whatever reason I had notes on this passage, and I was like, I'll just do this. It's the parable of the wedding feast, and basically it says a father is planning the wedding for his son. He sends out invitations. Everybody that gets invited doesn't show up. So he's prepared all this food, and he set the table, and he's gotten all these clothes together for everyone to wear, and then nobody shows up. So then he says, all right, now go out and find anyone to come to the feast, the wedding feast. And so that's like a picture of how the Jews were kind of God's, that race of people is who God worked with at a time, but they ended up rejecting Jesus and killing him, and then now everyone, in terms of a racial sense, is invited. There's even some versions of that parable where Jesus kind of explains that he sent out people to invite the guests to the wedding, and they killed the messengers. Then it says the son himself went out. They killed him. So then the father was enraged, and he burned the city. And that actually happened in the year 70. Jerusalem was burned. Anyway, kind of a sidebar there.
How often is stuff prophesied in Psalms? I never knew that there was stuff prophesied.
Oh, it's so what it is that the things that happen in David's life, when he's experiencing things, he will describe it in a way that it doesn't really fit his exact situation, to where it's like, obviously what he's saying is maybe how he's feeling about what he was going through, but then when it comes to Jesus's life, it's like specific. Like David wrote these things kind of metaphorically, like people are surrounding me, and they were surrounding him, but not literally. Or They're just different poetic things that David says in the Psalms. And of course, there's other psalm writers too. But then they like literally happen in Jesus' life. So it's like David was expressing pain or sorrow in these poetic, figurative ways. And then when you read Jesus' life, it's like, whoa, that is like exact, like this is literally happening to Jesus. So it's quite a lot. I think Psalms is probably the most quoted Old Testament book. Now I know it's the largest in terms of chapters, but the New Testament quotes Psalms more than any other Old Testament book. Specifically Psalm 110, which I don't know if David wrote that or not. I know that 1 through 70 are all David, and then it's jumbled. But anyway, yeah. There's a lot of stuff in there that is kind of foreshadowing. And it's like you can kind of see something's going on, but when Jesus shows up, it's like, okay, that's the clear picture of what was happening there. Yeah. So then after this meal, after the lunch break, if you will, says, well, obviously Ruth had some left over, so she must have wrapped up her leftovers because she ends up taking them home. And she goes back to work. So she rose to glean, and then Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean, even among the sheaves, which the sheave was when you kind of take your sickle, maybe is the word, and you've cut down the plant, then they would bundle them up. And that's what we're looking at here. So he says, basically let her pick up among the good stuff and then drop some from those bundles and leave it for her on purpose, basically, and do not rebuke her. So let her pick up what she needs, purposefully drop some so she can pick it up. And the law, remember we said required, I think Keller read the verses last time, that the farmers weren't supposed to harvest like every square inch of their property, but they're supposed to leave the edges. But other than that, and the fact that if they dropped something on the ground, that belonged to the poor. This whole thing about purposefully drop some and let her pick among the good stuff, that is Boaz being generous, and it wasn't required by the law. And just consider that this is a town coming off of a famine. And so this is not normally the time when people are generous. This is normally the time where people store and hoard up for themselves. And so they can, keep things and feel secure. It's not a time where people are like, yeah, take some, because they just knew what it was like to go without. And then it says, she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned. And it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. That's the lunch. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.
I don't know what glean means.
Glean. So we probably got into it last week. It's just a phrase for when you had a farmer who's got whatever crop he's growing. Boaz obviously has barley and some wheat here. Could be corn, whatever. The Old Testament law in several places, like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, maybe Numbers, but introduces this idea of gleaning, which is just when the harvesters would go out, the head farmer's employees, they would gather up what had grown. If anything dropped, or if there was anything left on the plants, the poor were allowed to come and take what was left. that was like their welfare program. But I said last week it's not like ours because you had to still go out and pick. You had to still go out and work. So, glean. Just think of it as like she's basically picking up what's left in the field when the workers are done. Yeah. So she completes the full workday. You know, after this lunchtime meal, she gets up and works until evening. Then it says she beat out what she had gleaned, and I sent a GIF earlier. Did you get that?
Okay. That's what that
Okay.
Gotcha.
So I was really looking into like what is the process, and this guy was demonstrating. It was like a video. If you don't have machinery, this is how you have to do it. So you cut down all your plants, and then you spread them out. And this guy literally took these 2 wood sticks and just starts wailing on them, right? And it breaks it up a little bit, and then he would pick it up and drop it, and the wind would take away the shell, or the chaff, we call it. And the grain that's useful would drop straight down. So you pick it up, and you do that several times. Then he got it all into a bucket and would pour it out, and that would even work a little bit better. Then after you had sat there and smacked it for all that time, he then took this big barrel, dumped it all in there, and he took this log and started and like cracking and even a next layer of shell off. Then he had to pour all that out, and the chaff would go away, and the grain would fall straight down. Then he would collect the grain, bag it up, and that's what you have something useful for. Could use whatever you need it for. You could use it for feeding your horses. We're told that in 1 Kings 4 that someone was feeding their horse with barley. But you could make bread with it too. And again, that takes us back to the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. In John 6:9, this is John's version of the events. We're told... John 6, I don't think I wrote that one down, did I? John 6:9?
Oh, you did.
Oh.
John 9.
There's a boy here who has 5 barley. What is that?
Barley.
Oh, 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Or what are they for so many?
Right, so there's 5,000 people, and they're saying, is there any food? Well, there's a boy here, and he's got 5 barley loaves, they're probably more like crackers, and 2 fish, but what good is that to feed such a large crowd? The boy had enough for those 5 little crackers, and Jesus used it to feed a multitude. Well, how much barley did Ruth have before the day was over? It says that what she had collected was about an ephah, which is about a half of a bushel, which still probably doesn't help you. Doesn't help me either. But it translates to 22 liters of these little grains. That would be 11 of those soda bottles. So really a lot here. Just for more context, in Ezekiel, an ephah, which is a dry measurement, a measurement for dry things, is listed next to a bath, which is a measurement for wet things, wet ingredients. And so those two are compared, a bath and an ephah. So think about, if you filled a tub up with rice or, that's probably the grain we're most familiar with is rice. That will be a lot of rice. And so this is a ton of grain. She could bathe in all the grain she had collected. She sets the world record for gleaning when you really stop and think about it. And if she had kept this pace up for the whole month, she would have had enough food for a family for an entire year. And in her family was Naomi, obviously, and Ruth brings home all this grain and her leftovers from lunch to share with Naomi. And Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, could really not believe all that Ruth had been given. She knew it was not possible for one person to collect all this grain without having help from someone who is extremely generous. So Naomi blessed the man, whoever he may be, blessed the hands that prepared this meal, right? We don't know exactly who did it, but somebody did it. And Ruth had so obviously been blessed that it led Naomi to praise the man who had provided for her. And I think in terms of the Christian life now, how great it would be if each and every one of us were to be so filled with joy, or have so much assurance, or to have so much hope that other people would, like, who gave you all this, right? Where did all this hope come from? And not hope in like a frivolous way, but like legitimate hope and faith and joy and love. Where did all this come from? And then just like Ruth tells Naomi, it was Boaz who gave me all this stuff, we could then tell others it was Jesus who did all this for us. And then after that, verse 20, it says, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Well, several things happen when Naomi hears it was Boaz. Hears about his generosity. For one, she doesn't say, well, whoever this guy is, he's not going to be as good as my son Mahlon, right? I hope you know that. That's how a lot of mothers would act when their son is involved. He ain't as good as your original husband. But instead, Naomi rejoices over this new connection between Ruth and Boaz, and that he's been so generous to her. And she reacts in a way that's identical to Abraham's servant in Genesis 24, who this servant was on a mission to find Isaac a wife. And so here in this story is also about a marriage happening. And so there are so many similarities that I'm actually going to read this story because I think it's pretty cool. But especially verse 27 is like a direct quote here that Naomi does. But I'm going to start reading in Genesis 24. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord. Now that must be an outdated cultural practice. That I may swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go into my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me into this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. And he made the camels kneel down outside of the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. We talked about how women typically draw the water last time, but remember Boaz said, drink from what the men have drawn. There's another way he was kind to her. And he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. So he's saying, I'm going to ask a question, and if it's the right girl, this is how she'll respond. And before he had, hold up. Let the young women to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please give me a little water to drink from your jar. She said, drink, my lord, and she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. So this is the right girl here because she did exactly what he said. And she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel, and 2 bracelets for her arms, weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. She added, we have plenty of both straw and fodder, and room to spend the night. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, this is what Naomi quotes, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master, Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. There's another word we hear in Ruth. Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. So that was a lot, but Naomi reacts in the same way that this master of Abraham, who's sent on this journey to find Isaac a wife, he says, blessed be God who has not forsaken his steadfast love to us. Like it's a way of saying like God is still being kind to us, still taking care of us, that sort of thing. Another reason why Naomi would praise God in this moment, not just because Boaz was so generous, but because he was one of the redeemers in the family of Elimelech. That's what Naomi says to Ruth. Now, that word means relatives, means brothers, but also used, you've heard the phrase maybe kinsman redeemer. And they actually had many jobs, although we know, because Boaz in this story of Ruth has gotten famous, we know this one particular role, but there were several roles that the kinsman redeemer played. One is in Leviticus 25:25. Oh, and there's also 47 through 49, but I don't know if I wrote that down. You got it? You gonna read it? Yep.
and sells part of his property. His nearest relative may come and redeem what his brother has sold.
All right, and can you pull up 47 through 49 of that same chapter?
If an alien or temporary resident living among you prospers, but your brother living near him becomes destitute and sells himself to the alien living among you, or to a member of the resident alien's home, he has the right of redemption after he has been sold.
Yeah, so if one of the men in the family was to come on hard times and have to sell the land that he owned just to get the money, then this redeemer of the family would then basically have the right to purchase the land back for the one who had to sell it. Also, if things were so bad that the man had to sell himself as a slave, this kinsman redeemer, this relative, would be able to come and buy them back. Another role of the kinsman redeemer is in Numbers 35, 16 through 21.
But if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. And if he struck him down with a stone tool that could cause death, and he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Or if he struck him down with a wooden tool that could cause death, and he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred or hurled something at him, lying in wait so that he died, or in enmity struck him down with his hands so that he died, then he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him.
Yeah, so the Hebrew word for blood avenger there is the same one that is used for kinsman redeemer. It's Goal, to us it would look like G-O apostrophe O-L. So it's the same word that is used in all those Leviticus 25, Numbers 35, and Ruth 2. So this was Boaz's role among his clan, to care for his brothers by taking back their land, to buy them back out of slavery, and yes, even getting vengeance on anyone who might murder them. And this was good news for Naomi and Ruth, because the land that was owned by Elimelech, who is dead and gone at this point, is in need of redeeming, needs to be bought back. And they need someone to provide for them, and Boaz is able to do both of these things. And he's the kinsman redeemer of their clan. Kinsman meaning, like when people say kin, you think about the only time we really use that in, well, there's a couple places we use that today, but what is it? We wish you a Merry Christmas, right? To you and your kin, right? Your family, your kinsman, and then redeemer. That's the word there, that Hebrew word we just looked at. The one who could buy back something that was lost. So in this way, Boaz is again a foreshadowing of what Jesus does, because first, Jesus became one of our own, a kinsman. He came to earth and took on a human body, a human humanity. And this is what Hebrews 2:14 says.
Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil.
Yeah, so Jesus, in coming here, took on the same flesh and blood we have, to be our brother, to be our relative, and then deliver us as one of our brothers, if you will. I think in that same chapter it even says, or somewhere else in Hebrews, he's not ashamed to call us brothers. Yeah, but also Jesus is our blood avenger, if you will. And we're going to read Romans 12:19.
Beloved, Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.
Yeah. And just like Ruth and Naomi needed a provider, the same way we can't live without or we definitely can't have eternal life without what Jesus gave us. And in this moment, the Lord has given Ruth these first interactions with Boaz. And I think it must have been a relief for Ruth to meet this man, because remember, we're in the time of the judges. And so when Naomi has to say, it's a good idea for you to work in Boaz's field because somewhere else you will be assaulted. That's because in the time of the judges, people were as bad as they've been, It's a dark book, right? If you were a woman in those days and you needed a real man to provide for you, due to all the sin, rape, theft, and murder that is talked about in the book of Judges, you might have been left saying, are there any men left? Is there anyone worth marrying? Is there any decent person left, right? Well, then Boaz comes along and it says he's a worthy man, which is rare for the time, and he happens to be of the tribe of Elimelech, which means he's eligible to marry Ruth. And just as a side note, even though Boaz, he probably seemed so great to Ruth, I like how at the end it says Ruth lived with Naomi for the duration of the harvest, right? Boaz was so great, but she didn't say, well, let's go ahead and move in together, or let's, whatever, but I'm going to live with Naomi. And that's going to be key. I'll leave you with that, because the next part of the story we read, the way things are worded, we could interpret it in a way that's kind of Hollywood, rated R. We could read it in a sleazy way. Just being honest with you, there is an interpretation of the next chapter that says some things happen, and I don't think they did, and I think this is evidence of it. Ruth didn't say, hey, let's shack up, me and you, Boaz, we'll be married anytime soon, so I'll just live with you, but it says she lived with Naomi. So that's just to whet your appetite for the next time. And that's Ruth chapter 2.